So what I'm going to do is run you through what we've identified as 10 trends to pay particular attention to during the course of 2021. It's something we do every year. And I have to say, with hindsight, sort of standing there saying 10 things to watch in 2020 proved to be a bit of a mug's game in one sense, because obviously there was one issue that came to dominate everything and anything that we were talking about. And superficially, at least, it knocked off the headlines, all of the issues that had actually, we expected to be the things that would dominate our thinking. But of course, with hindsight, we're certainly not the only people pointing out that actually one of the biggest impacts of COVID has not actually been to change things completely, so much as to accelerate or accentuate quite a lot of the trends that actually were already evident, even though potentially affecting them in different ways. And fortunately, as we head into this year, the arrival of the vaccines, or the prospect of vaccines in some places, at least offers us an opportunity to start thinking about what the so-called new normal potentially will look like. And so in highlighting 10 things that we think people should be thinking about, 2 points to make. Firstly, these are kind of COVID informed, COVID implicit, not explicit. Really trying to look behind the COVID headlines at what else has been going on and how we think this is going to play out. Also to point out that actually we like looking at the fundamental trends that we think are going on in the world and then trying to interpret those from a real estate perspective. So you'll see there's a number of things in here that are pretty directly real estate related. Some others perhaps less, more peripherally so. So diving straight in. Number one, deglobalization 2.0, because we actually talked about this quite extensively last year, where we were pointing out that the globalization has, for a little while now, at the very least, been slowing. We're not talking about, a complete end to the global world, far from it. But important to recognize that for various reasons, changing labor cost, reducing labor cost differentials, protectionism and nationalism, which we're certainly seeing coming through in a lot of countries, the impact of technology, desire to reduce carbon. The pace of globalization was already slowing and in some important ways was starting to reverse even before we got to the beginning of this year. And of course, the travel restrictions and some of the sort of issues that people have faced in thinking about the way in which the world is operating now, if anything, are going to slow that. And this may only be happening at the margins, but of course, that's where pricing is determined. And what we're trying to do here is to look at some of the shifts that are happening in order to get ahead of what we think could well emerge as quite significant trends. And that's been given a massive boost in the case of changes to globalization by what's happened during the pandemic. Because what we've seen is a real emphasis and a shift in emphasis in supply chains, thinking about how to reduce risk. Because what we saw was that Wuhan was not just the epicenter of the latest pandemic, it is the epicenter of the world's supply chains. 40% of the global 500 companies, Fortune Global 500, have direct suppliers in Wuhan. And 90% of the global Fortune 100 have a tier 1 or a tier 2 supplier in Wuhan. And so those stories, whether that's about empty shelves or about car components or semiconductor components being brought out of southern China in suitcases by senior executives, highlights the level of risk to the global supply chains that's been emphasized. And even though lots of people were looking at a sort of China +1 strategy, in most cases, the +1 that they're looking at to try and diversify those risks, it's +1 out of sort of 2 or 3 main options. And so what we're seeing is organizations really looking at how to adjust their supply chains in order to make them more robust, shortening the supply chains, making them more flexible, introducing parallel capacity, the so-called shift in emphasis from just in time to just in case, coupled with introduction of robotics and automation to counter the fact that a lot of activities is thinking about moving back to areas that are higher cost from a production point of view. So manufacturing might come back, but not necessarily jobs. and the introduction of digital supply network technology, which will clearly be crucial in managing what are likely to become more complex supply chains. So lots of changes going on. And certainly, I think putting some wrinkles in the sort of the simplistic story of, growing demand for industrial and particularly logistics space off the back of e-commerce. That's happening, but there are some other changes that are happening as well. Trend number 2, we've called no place like home. From our point of view, it's not necessarily that surprising when you think about it that people have been able to work from home. So many people have been able to work from home in the way in which they have. What we find surprising is just how many people allegedly are reporting that they find home working more productive. And we spent some time looking at this, including at some of the previous research that has been done, and we've got a report coming out on this fairly shortly, looking at, for example, a seminal study of C-Trip, a travel agency, an online travel agency in China, and at their call center in 2013, there was a big study done of over 250 volunteers over 9 months who worked from home. And that study identified a 13% performance increase, coupled with lower attrition rates, higher levels of job satisfaction. And at the end of the study, 50% of the employees involved switched permanently. And we've been interested in why that is in a report that came out late last year. We used a sort of a modified Maslow hierarchy of needs to look at, the different types of work that people do and the different needs that brings. Because, of course, at its most fundamental, and if you think in the early stages of the pandemic, when everybody was simply trying to keep, business as usual, going as usual, support existing clients, maintain existing relationships, get those instructions completed and keep the wheels turning. For many organizations which have already invested in flex technology, if people have got laptops, if you've got systems where remote login is possible, frankly, once you're sitting at home, work is what you do, not where you are. And therefore, if you can sit at home with a desk, a chair, and a bit of technology, it's actually perfectly possible to log on and carry on working, in some cases, potentially more productively. Obviously some people's home circumstances don't support that, but for many of us are lucky enough that they do. And, the absence of jet lag, the absence of commuting, working and using Zoom like this in order to interact. You remember the days when we all used to sit on late night conference calls, just sitting on the end of a mobile phone? What on earth was that all around? That we've used technology and found ways to work much better. And so particularly for a lot of those sort of transactional type relationships and processing work, it's not surprising that many people are saying, actually, sitting at home in my own environment, I quite like that, and I feel more productive. But obviously, that it isn't without its downsides. There is a big community of remote and home workers. Work that's been done over the years identifies that issues of collaboration and communication, loneliness, difficulties in unplugging are quite commonplace amongst many of the people who do work remotely. And of course, organizations in the past have identified that whilst there are upsides with remote working, there are potential downsides as well. Work is more than just a set of sort of emails and conversations. It's about interaction with people. We are inherently, human animals are inherently social creatures. And whilst the fuss at Yahoo around trying to reduce the amount of home working and forcing people back into the office didn't work out particularly well for Yahoo and Marissa Mayer back in 2013, I think we can appreciate the sentiments that lie behind what they were doing, which is to say that actually being part of the team it involves more than just sharing a business card. You need to interact, and a lot of that happens best when you're working face to face. And if you go back and look at a lot of the remote working research, for example, the C-Trip study, important to note that firstly, even the people involved in that study, they're only working at home 4 days a week, still 1 day a week in the office. It's call center work, and so that type of work is particularly potentially suited to being able to work remotely. Their home environment was very strictly controlled. They had to be in a discrete environment where they weren't going to be interrupted. And of the 13% increase in productivity, notable that 9% of that was down to working longer hours. So clearly, there's a lot more to this story than simply home working being productive. And broadly, our conclusion is that this experiment has certainly emphasized to people the benefits of flexibility. For many employees, they're really going to value that. And flexible working, of which home working is only a part, is definitely here to stay. But we believe that there is definitely a big role and a big future for the office and for the workplace, because home working alone certainly cannot replicate everything that people want. But thirdly, our third trend, we definitely think that this has huge implications for the workplace. And this we call workplace experience. The way in which people perceive different types of working environments varies. You can pretty well clearly see what this particular journalist happens to think of open plan offices. And if those sorts of environments weren't particularly attractive before, then they certainly right now don't feel any more attractive than they were, arguably much less so. It's important to remember that the types of shifts that we've seen in the way offices and layouts have been done were done for very good intentions, very, very good reasons. The desire to bring people out of cellular offices, to promote collaboration, to promote interaction, and to incorporate a different range of working environments is very well intentioned. The problem is that in so doing, we've actually in many cases just depersonalized space. And the theory is great, but in reality, what tends to happen is people come in and sit at one of the serried ranks of pretty uniform desks that are available. They don't move between environments in the office according to what work they're doing. They sit there and do the same thing at the same desk, or all the things they have to do, they do in the same place. And we think that in order to encourage people back to the office, in order to people who've got a choice, to encourage them to move back to the office and think more about what is it that they're going to, what they're going to do, how are they going to interact with the environment, and therefore why is it important to be in the office. Employers and landlords are going to have to really focus around the type of space they're providing, optionality of different types of space, giving people the opportunity with technology or otherwise to actually personalize the space, to give them back some of the benefits that they found from working at home or working remotely, integrating technology, and offering a curated experience, helping people to understand how best to use that workplace. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Different environments and workspaces will work for different organizations and different individuals and people. And it's a journey. It's going to be about the continued evolution of workspace. But absolutely, this is where the war for talent, this is where trying to attract and retain that best talent is really going to hit home. Because we believe that organizations that really do understand what their talent is asking for and provide environments that allows their people to work together most effectively are definitely going to be in an advantage. And the work that we've done surveying large companies, all of which is available online, highlights that there are quite a significant number of different changes that people are making of all sorts. Of course, at the moment, we're looking through this, as Kim Pollitzer says, through the lens of current experience, and that tends to accentuate the way in which people think change is going to happen. But irrespective of what the degree is, we're convinced that this is going to put much more emphasis in thinking about the role of the workplace and the office in particular, and designing and building to that need. And it's not just the nature of the workplace that's going to change for occupiers. The whole concept of the portfolio and the way it's put together, we think is going to be changing. This is something that was happening already. But the big three things that major occupiers are focused on when thinking about their organization and about the role of real estate are, firstly, talent attraction and retention. And in the past, discussion about where people want to live and what sort of, do they want to be in the towns or the cities, has sounded a little bit, in some cases, a bit ephemeral. That's really come to the fore with lots of debate at the moment about urban versus suburban, about migration and movements of people. Huge debates going on at the moment about some of the movements of people that we're seeing between major and smaller cities and between different parts of the US. And this is going to be accentuated as many people have been really confronted with big choices individually about where they want to live and work. And that's going to play through in portfolios. Secondly, organizations obviously focused on cost reduction. Whether, I mean, because to varying degrees, whether or not technically we're living through a recession, for many organizations right now, it feels like one. And certainly organizations that have got surplus space are looking at how can they offload that, how can they downsize their portfolios, and how can they reduce the costs of real estate on their balance sheet and their operating costs in order to operate more effectively. Thirdly, linked to that, operational flexibility. How do we adjust our portfolio, whether it's the size, the type of space, the location of that space? How do we flex our portfolio in cost-effective ways in order to meet our needs and meet what seem to be our ever-changing needs? And here we think that there's going to be some really significant changes because, of course, over the last few years, you remember the flex office debate that was on everybody's lips 18 months ago as being the topic du jour. That's absolutely been accentuated. There are this huge range now of different options for occupiers to procure, occupy, manage, lease, own space, and operate it in different ways, different types of relationships with different sorts of organizations. Huge range of options out there. And it certainly isn't a question of either a traditional office in a CBD of a big city or home working, or even throwing co-working into the mix. There's a much wider range of options there. And we think that people are going to be experimenting. We're seeing announcements coming about that already. What we think is most significant is that in talking to some of the most forward-thinking organizations, what they're telling us is they already had plans. They'd already looked at a lot of these different options, and they had plans that had been shelved pre-COVID. They thought that they would work from a financial point of view. They thought they would work from an operational point of view. What was stopping them was that they couldn't see their way through the change management. They couldn't see how to get the organization to take on board the kind of shift in working that was going to be needed to make these options work. COVID-19 has provided a real control-alt-delete moment because a lot of those plans are now being dusted off because rather than being too radical to even think about, many of them now actually start looking like quite sensible ways potentially to start exploring different ways of getting back to work and giving people different options as to how they work. And so we think that we're going to see quite a lot of experimentation over the next 12 to 24 months. Of course, it takes time for these things to ripple through people's portfolios because there are lease structures already in place. But we think that these are relatively low-cost options and low-risk opportunities to experiment and see what the future might hold. And from what organizations are telling us, they're certainly looking at lots of different ways. They don't know what this is going to do yet. They don't know how it's going to play out, but almost all organizations are looking for more flexibility and they're looking at changes in the way in which they run and occupy space. So an area of big difference. Fifth, and the last of our trends, looking particularly at sort of, the commercial real estate market per se, what we call managing expectations. I have to say, from my point of view, and it's a bit invidious to talk about heroes when there are so many out there in our frontline services who deserve that label. But to me, the unsung heroes of the real estate market during this crisis have been the property managers on both the landlord and the occupier side, because they've really been in the front line of working through how to continue to maintain and operate or how to close down facilities. The front line of those hard negotiations around what to do about rent, how to help organizations stay solvent whilst also making sure that landlords are getting paid some rent. Those discussions and this crisis have had some significant lessons that we believe will endure in the way in which people think about property and asset management. The first is that relationships count. The way in which people have been interacting, it's quite clear that landlords and occupiers who had a good relationship and a close relationship beforehand have found it much easier to get through and deal with this crisis, and really thinking about what are the needs of the occupier and what are the needs of the landlord. And that kind of personal relationship is absolutely key. Secondly, the role of data and technology, both for owners and occupiers. The data and technology that helps us understand how are buildings being used, how are they being occupied, how are they performing, what different types of space are being used, how are they performing from an operational point of view, and even technology that allows buildings to be monitored and managed remotely have all come into their own. And we're seeing a big uptick in interest from both owners and occupiers in this type of technology. I think there's going to be a big explosion in this area. And the third, back to the relationship thing, is about alignment of interest. We're quite used to thinking about this in a retail context, where now it's recognized that the shop owner, the shop operator, the retailer, and the owner manager of a shopping center have absolutely got a common interest in getting people in through the door and getting them spending money in the shops. And in some ways, we can think of COVID-19 as being the sort of the online retail moment for the office sector. Because of course, you've got all of us sitting at home who, to some degree or another, will start having a choice. Well, do I want to go into the office tomorrow? Or actually, am I quite happy working here or working from somewhere else? And so what we're going to see is actually more of an alignment of interest between landlords and occupiers in the office sector. Again, back to this idea of a curated experience, owners and occupiers working together to put together an office workplace environment or an industrial workplace environment that is really attractive to people and supports what it is that people want to do, whatever the rights and wrongs of individual business models. This is the sort of concept, the office as a hotel that WeWork and others of the flex operators have really focused on. And I think that we're going to see this coming through in all sorts of ways around the way in which occupiers and landlords work together. But the integration of technology is going to be absolutely key. Number 6, hyperlocal. Clearly, one of the biggest impacts that we've seen of the pandemic has been in the rapid growth in online retail activity that we've seen. Particularly in the food sector with click and collect, but actually exploding into all sorts of areas of retail. And it's had a number of sort of slightly more structural impacts in the sense that we've seen not just those of us who shopped online before increasing the amount of online shopping that we've been doing, but a whole new generation of shoppers, people who've never bought anything online before, are being forced or being pulled online because of the close down of physical retail. And in turn, that's meant that we've then seen different people buying different goods online, and the growth in the number of retailers are online, because pretty much all retailers have been forced to work out how do we get online, because that's the only vehicle and the only channel that's left open to us. And indeed, back to my previous point about landlords and tenants working together, in a number of the shopping centres that we manage, we've had landlords helping their retail tenants get online, providing advice and support as to how to create an online presence, because they recognise that that's what the retailer needs if they want them to be alive and paying rent by the time they're able to reopen the shopping centre. So recognition of that alignment of interest. One of the things that's really challenging for all of these new retailers, of course, is that they don't necessarily have the infrastructure of a lot of the bigger players. The emphasis is still very much on being quicker and being cheaper. And across all areas, we're really seeing the emphasis on last mile, that focus on how do you quickly and effectively deal with that last mile of delivery from the last point of aggregation out to the actual consumer. And we're seeing in this area, this is where we're seeing lots of innovation. We've seen big increase in the number of dark kitchens, whether that's former retail units or industrial space being converted to production of food, not for online, for in-store consumption, but for delivery, or for, in some cases, for click and collect. And there's been a big growth in that. We've seen lots of expansion of click and collect, at least prior to the most recent lockdowns. Lots of growth in click and collect, whether that's in-store, stores being repurposed with order picking going on in stores for click and collect in-store. Actually, in some ways, starting to reinforce again the role of the physical store in that distribution network, which I think is something that is quite often overlooked when people are talking about the likely death of physical retail. And also changes in that click and collect model itself, and further growth in the sort of technologically supported online order pickup. One of the most exciting areas that we see is around hyperlocal innovation around micro fulfillment. The picture at the bottom here is, and this is not only sort of collectives and different people finding different ways as organizations to get together and support local delivery services to help keep local retailers alive, but Fabric shown here. an Israeli company, currently in Israel, currently in the US, in New York, taking car parks underneath large office buildings in the center of New York, populating them with robots, doing micro fulfillment of online orders for local retailers, enabling them to compete with 1 hour delivery in the center of these very densely populated cities in a way that actually competes really effectively with some of the bigger players. And indeed, in the UK, we've recently seen Amazon come out as the top bidder for some car park space that was being marketed right in the middle of the city of London, again, to support its urban fulfillment. So again, maybe limited at the moment, but signs of real change and real innovation that are going to be quite exciting in this space. And I think, offer some interesting perspectives on what's going to happen with retail and the role that retail will play in the center of cities. And that links to trend number 7, love thy neighborhood. We're well aware of the very significant challenges that many urban areas face. Declining retail, offices tending to sort of concentrate in the middle of more larger urban centres, the so-called sort of hollowing out of many of the cities and areas where we live. And there's no denying that typically reflects a huge range of different challenges, social challenges, political and issues that are very, very difficult to tackle. And we don't want to belittle those in any way. But what's interesting is, if you look at the impact that COVID-19 has had, widely reported and evident, for example, here in the Google mobility stats, in the recovery indices that we've been putting together, that if you look at the impact COVID's had, it's disproportionately hugely impacted the center of the cities, center of towns, the larger urban areas. And while suburban areas and smaller market towns have definitely been affected, they haven't been affected anything like as badly, because we've been forced to spend more of our time working from home. We've been tending to go out and shop and socialize and do whatever else we're doing more around the areas where we live, rather than in the center of the cities where we typically used to work. And there is some evidence emerging that, whilst they've been impacted, they obviously been impacted, we're seeing some stronger recovery coming through in interest in local shop units and in potential high street or small business units in some of these suburban areas and in smaller towns than we are seeing in the center of cities. And we think this plays into the concept from a planning and development point of view of the 15-minute city, which is really gaining a lot of popularity in thinking about urban regeneration and redevelopment. The idea that in a healthy environment, urban environment, it's great if you've got what you need from a live, a work, a play, a shop, a leisure, amenities. If all of those things are accessible within 15 minutes of where you live, that creates a healthy and dynamic environment. It's one that planners are trying to implement. And indeed, there is evidence that that from a real estate perspective, rental growth performance and income performance is stronger, and value performance is stronger in these types of environments. Because that mix of uses really brings a sense of identity that people enjoy. And you only need to think of some, the sort of the Greenwich Village effect in New York, the regeneration that's gone on around Marylebone High Street in London as just 2 examples of how that kind of neighborhood regeneration can actually have really strong commercial impacts. And during the course of the lockdowns, we're seeing a lot of those community initiatives coming through, which have been boosted by COVID. These are not, in many cases, they aren't just sort of isolated things. These are evident coming through in many, many, many parts of the world. And again, they're not a panacea, but they do show signs that local communities are responding, that people are trying to rebuild the center of cities. And indeed, again, another Israeli company, Then, who are banding together groups of real estate owners in different parts of cities, providing technology in order to build on these sorts of community initiatives, build networks of interlinkage between local businesses, local communities, local shops, to again try and stimulate these kinds of development activities, which do have very, very strong direct real estate benefits and offer potential opportunities and interesting insights as to what some of the future for some of our urban areas may be. Trend number 8, risky business, was almost exactly this time last year when we were out and about talking about our 10 trends and highlighting the way in which climate change was starting to impact particularly local government policies with, New York Climate Act and so on coming in. That Larry Fink of BlackRock sent his now sort of infamous letter out to large businesses and to shareholders, talking about BlackRock's effective pivoting in order to put climate risk right at the center of the way in which BlackRock were going to be thinking about investing and bluntly where to put their $7 trillion of assets under management. And the point that Larry Fink was making was that climate risk is now quite clearly investment risk, because the job of the capital markets is to look forward at the future income streams that are going to be generated and the future performance of businesses and pull that performance back into current pricing. And they can now see that climate risk absolutely is part of the business risk that businesses are facing. And therefore, the capital markets are going to look forward at how well they think businesses are going to do, how these impacts are going to play out. They're going to pull that into pricing now. And as a result, climate risk in the future is investment risk today, even well in advance of when we're going to start seeing all of the direct impacts actually coming through in the real world. And therefore, he was talking about the significant reallocation of capital that he wanted to get out ahead of. And we think that 2020, with hindsight, despite the fact that Greta Thunberg was not on the front page of the paper every day in the way she was in 2019, 2020 has been a tipping point for the way in which organizations think about this. For the first time ever, the WEF's Global Risk Landscape analysis that was published fairly early in the year identified the top 5 risks in the world as all coming from one category. And that category was the environment and man's impact on it. And companies are very definitely responding. The growth in the number of major companies signing up to science-based targets, signing up to TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, has gone up very, very significantly. And as the private sector and big companies start to report on and make themselves more transparent so that stakeholders can see how they're doing, that very quickly for the leading organizations leads them to focus on their indirect emissions. And that's really significant for us. Twofold. I mean, firstly, of course, real estate is a major part of every organization's carbon footprint. And so it's something that everybody was already focusing on. But these big organizations, when they start looking at their indirect emissions, they identify their business travel. And particularly, they look at the impact on of their supply chain. And given that some of the leading organizations signing up to these are those with the biggest supply chain, big technology companies, financial services companies, FMCG companies, we face this, and I'm sure many of you do. When we go in for a pitch for any kind of significant instruction, now we absolutely have to show what are our credentials and what are we doing about our carbon footprint. And that has a massive impact on the way in which businesses across the world are going to behave. And so that ripple out through the supply chain is a really big driver. And, we've seen late last year, the UK announcing that TCFD reporting was going to be compulsory from 2025 for pretty much all businesses. And it's compulsory from this year for the biggest ones, which is something that Larry Fink has applauded, and he's going to put pressure on the US government, which with the change of presidency there, I think is quite possible that we'll see that pressure coming through. So climate with the next climate conference taking place in COP26 taking place in Glasgow later this year, it's going to be a big issue that we see and hear a lot about, particularly in real estate. Number 9, building a recovery. Last year we talked about lower for longer. It was almost the 10th anniversary last year of lower for longer. If it was lower for longer then, boy oh boy, is it lower for longer now. Watching the lunchtime news today, breaking news that the Bank of England is keeping interest rates on hold at 0.1%. Well, there's a surprise. This really is absolutely unprecedented. And given the amount of money that governments have pumped into making sure that they prop up their economies, we've now got interest rates nailed to the floor and likely to remain so for some considerable period. And what's interesting, of course, is that the reaction that we're seeing to the current crisis from international organizations, particularly the IMF and the World Bank, has been very different. There's obviously a pre-COVID meeting of the UN, has been very, very different to what we saw previously. That now the IMF is urging, far from austerity, urging governments to spend their way out of the pandemic. And whether it's Boris's levelling up agenda or the Green Industrial Revolution or Justin Trudeau or, of course, Joe Biden, we've seen investment in infrastructure and the climate debate really feature very, very strongly from politicians around the world. And investing in infrastructure is we think is going to be a key plank of people's economic recovery strategy moving forward. And in some cases, there will be some of sort of China's post-GFC approach of building roads and railways and conventional types of infrastructure. There'll be some of that. There's already some of that going on, certainly in the UK. In fact, it's more likely to be infrastructure for the 21st century, investment in electric vehicle charging infrastructure, in green energy, renewable energy, in data centers and other smart technology to support the growth of smart cities, the rollout of next generation telecoms. Clearly, we're likely to see a lot of investment in infrastructure, both private and public sector, around bioscience, life sciences, healthcare, and things like that for obvious reasons. And I have to say, certainly here in the UK, if you look at the focus that has been on key workers, I think that we are likely to see a big political push from all sides of the political spectrum for investment in social infrastructure. Where the education, particularly higher education, goes is an interesting question. But I think investment in public infrastructure, social infrastructure, to some extent housing, but certainly healthcare facilities is almost certain to come onto the agenda. And of course, for us in real estate, all of that has huge implications, particularly at a time, as I'm sure the panel will discuss, when we see core yields on core real estate investment pretty low, returns being pretty unexciting, and therefore people looking for those core type income streams are likely to be looking elsewhere for places to put that money. And many of these types of infrastructure investments, while certainly not exactly the same as a real estate investment, they offer many similar sorts of characteristics. And finally, number 10, and this is perhaps one, if some of the others are things to worry about at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, this might be more one to ponder at 5 o'clock with a glass of wine in your hand, but we still think it's important. We call it measure for measure, and it relates to the way in which we think about measuring success, not at the organizational level, but at the national level. We're used to the concept of GDP just being the default standard by which we compare countries, the sum of the value of goods and services produced within a country over a given period, typically a year. And we use it all the time. It's just the default. And that's true to such an extent that, this quote obviously from Clinton's campaign in the US in 1992, it's now kind of widely accepted that it's the economy generally that is the determining factor in deciding elections. And that's really, why GDP is referred to as the most important statistic in human history. And there's a tendency to think that it's kind of inevitable, isn't it? I mean, that's just the way it is. And so perhaps worth pointing out that GDP was, to all intents and purposes, invented in 1930s America during the Depression. If you think about it, the concept at that point that just doing more, producing more, doing more of everything was just beneficial kind of makes sense, because the more stuff you do, the more you're likely generally to be benefiting the majority of the population. But as Simon Kuznets, the economist who actually championed and effectively developed GDP, pointed out, there are some significant challenges with it. The main challenge that a lot of people are now focusing on is that GDP focuses on just the amount of stuff and the amount of growth, not the quality of that growth. And it says absolutely nothing about the human or the environmental cost of achieving that growth. And Joseph Stiglitz, who unashamedly comes from a particular point on the political spectrum, but interesting, he points out that, if you look at GDP numbers, with the exception of the most immediate impact of COVID, they seem to be suggesting that there's nothing fundamentally wrong in the world. And yet, if you look around, it is arguable that at the very least, we are facing a climate crisis, and arguably we are facing an inequality crisis. And none of that really shows up certainly in the GDP stats. And as we think about how do we drive recovery from what is now the second major global crisis within the space effectively of a decade, there's a lot of concern over this issue of inequality, the K-shaped recovery, which certainly characterized the GFC, and there is concern will certainly characterize the recovery that we see now. The idea that we should build back better was not invented by Joe Biden. It was actually a concept popularized by the UN nearly 20 years ago now. And it's an idea that seems to have, to be of its time. And particularly if you bear in mind, when we think about an individual organization right now, think back to what Larry Fink is saying, it's perfectly sensible to think, we were used to thinking about organizations from an ESG perspective. We have to think, not that profit isn't important, of course it is, but it needs to be balanced with thinking about the planet and about people, the social and environmental impact of what we do. And as Peter Drucker says, well, Peter Drucker said millions of things and has lots of things attributed to him, but, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, or what gets measured gets managed. And GDP isn't the only thing that we could or should be looking at. World Economic Forum Inclusive Development Index is a way of looking at national performance through a wider range of different lenses. It's got in there the GDP, the employment, some of the conventional metrics, but it's also got in there things around equality, around productivity, around the environment, around sustainability, around carbon, around equality, around income distribution, which provide quite a more rounded measure of success at the national level. And interestingly, if you look at how countries score on this, and countries are scored against this criteria in this index, if you compare that with national indices that look explicitly at how happy are the population, how overall, how happy and contented are people, there's quite a high correlation, which I would argue is no coincidence. And you don't have to agree with everything that Joseph Stiglitz says to recognize there's some truth in the fact that if we measure the wrong thing, we will do the wrong thing. And I'm not talking about this because from a political viewpoint, from a real estate viewpoint, I think it's incredibly important, because if governments were to start shifting on focusing on driving this wider range of indicators rather than just GDP, that would almost certainly have quite a big impact on the types of policies they were putting out, and therefore on the shape of opportunity in our real estate markets. And, I am very proud about the fact that Avison Young recently went through an exercise to really think carefully about what we believe our purpose to be. And our clear purpose statement is that we exist in order to create real economic, social, and environmental value as a global real estate advisor powered by people. And we certainly see that there is huge opportunity for us and for our clients in those social and environmental spheres, as well as the pure economic ones.